Siamo qui con Craig Thompson, fumettista di fama internazionale e autore di opere magnifiche quali Addio Chunky Rice, Blankets, Habibi, graphic novel che gli hanno fatto guadagnare tantissimi premi importanti nel mondo del fumetto. Prima di addentrarci nello specifico delle tue opere, vorrei chiederti di poterci raccontare i tuoi esordi nel mondo del fumetto. Qual è la tua storia, come hai iniziato e quali sono state le maggiori ispirazioni all'inizio della tua carriera?
Well, I started drawing when I was 4 years old, and the story from my parents is that the church missionary who was visiting from Indonesia showed me how to color within the lines of a coloring book. I saw the comic strips in the Sunday newspaper, Charlie Brown, Peanuts. Also, it's a very religious household, so all of the media in the house, like TV and movies and music, was strictly censored. But comic books, because they were kids' stuff, were below that censorship radar. And then I grew up in a very rural community, farming community, and I did a lot of farm work. I started very young, when I was, say, 9 years old, and I used all the money I earned on the farm to buy comic books. It was that money that fueled my comic book hobby, but while I was working on the farm, I would dream of someday hiding inside and just drawing pictures all day, rather than sweating and toiling in the dirt.
La tua vita prima di diventare fumettista è stata piena di esperienze diverse e sicuramente anche l'ambiente familiare in cui vivevi ha giocato un ruolo fondamentale nel tuo cammino. Come mai poi hai deciso di esporti così tanto con le tue prime opere? Cosa ti ha spinto a usare proprio il fumetto come medium per raccontarti?
Yeah, comic books, for my little brother and I, my brother was 3 years younger, it was like a little sort of secret that we had that our parents didn't know about. You know, it started with Sunday sort of comic strips in the newspaper, but then we started buying Mad magazine, humor magazines on the newsstand. You know, my family was not very intimate. They weren't very close. Kind of the opposite of Italian families. I feel like Italian families are really close with each other, also very expressive. But in stoic Midwestern American culture, you never talk about your feelings, you never talk about ideas. You talk about the weather and the Bible. That's it.
Quindi hai usato il fumetto proprio per sfogarti in qualche maniera ed esprimere i tuoi sentimenti?
That's definitely what I used blankets for. It was my coming out story, coming out with my spirituality.
E quindi il fumetto è stato anche una sorta di ponte tra te e tuo fratello.
So, to clarify, I also have a sister, and she's not in blankets. The act of writing the book brought me far closer to my brother and sister. So I would get on the phone with them, and we would talk about our shared childhood memories, spiritual beliefs, our sexuality. We'd never had these sort of conversations ever in our life, so we became much closer during the process of writing the book. The first draft of the book was not autobiographical. In terms of storytelling, there wasn't a reason for her to be there. I talked to my sister, I said, I'm doing this book, it's about our family, like this is here, this is here, this is here, but you're not in the book. And she was happy, she was relieved. In my childhood, she was sort of a background character. I was very close to my brother, we did everything together. But with my sister, I barely ever hung out with her. She was the neglected child, she had to do everything by herself.
Il tuo esordio nel mondo della graphic novel è Addio Chunky Rice, una sorta di favola intimista a tratti estremamente malinconica. Come è nato questo primo libro e con quali propositi lo hai realizzato?
So I started Goodbye Chunky Rice when I was 21 years old, and I moved from my home state of Wisconsin to Portland, Oregon. And I left behind all my close friends in Milwaukee. And when I moved to Portland, I was very much miserable for 2 years. So I started this book after my move, about the loss, you know, about the move, about missing my friends. And at that time in my life, that drawing style was the only way I worked. I had a very cutesy, cartoony style. And I wanted to create a book that was more like a song. I was interested in if comics were able to capture an emotion the way a song does. You know, and if there's a song that you associate with a breakup or with missing friends.
In questa tua prima opera è evidente il tuo stile di disegno caratteristico. Quali sono state le tue influenze artistiche e quanto ci hai messo a definire il tuo stile personale?
That's a great question. Well, I mean, my influences at that time were sort of Tim Burton, you know, all the Tim Burton movies, Dr. Seuss, Disney cartoons, you know, Warner Brothers, Bugs Bunny, anything animated. But in comic books, there were a couple books that influenced me a lot. And I think both of them are not well known. One is by Walt Holcomb. It's called King of Persia. And it was like an 80-page book that came out in the 90s. that was about a love story between a camel and a sultan, which is weird because maybe it influenced Habibi a little bit too. But it was very, very cute and cartoony, very wistful, very melancholy. One of the first the first comic book I ever read that made me cry. So I was really influenced by that, and then by a book called Hutch Owen's Working Hard by Tom Hart, which was sort of this little punk rock manifesto about a homeless guy. I guess the connecting thread between those two books was poetry. I was really interested in trying to do something that was more like poetry in the comic book form.
Oltre ai cartoni animati ti sei ispirato anche a qualche artista o corrente artistica particolare? Perché ogni tanto vedendo le tue tavole sembra di vedere un quadro di Van Gogh.
At that time it was probably more poppy artists like Miro or Paul Klee. You mentioned Van Gogh, of course, he's a huge influence, and that sort of turn of the century artists, Gauguin and Lautrec. So it depends on the project, what I'm most obsessed with. But it's always important to me as a cartoonist to draw references from the world of fine art and to draw references from the world of literature. When I was working on blankets, every morning when I woke up, I would look at art books. And then in the afternoon, when I took my lunch, I would read a novel. That was my nutrition. They always accompany my meals. Breakfast, pictures, lunch, words. And somehow in my brain, that combines into comics.
Dopo Addio Chunky Rice è il turno di Blankets. Quando la lessi per la prima volta fu difficile superare la tristezza dopo averlo concluso. Tu che ne sei l'autore, è stato difficile ripercorrere delle tappe così malinconiche della tua adolescenza mentre lo realizzavi?
Okay, that's a good question. To be honest, those memories weren't that far away at the time I started the book. So I was around 23 years old. I don't think I could do a book like Blankets now that I'm 40. The difficult element was the religious part. Again, I mentioned earlier that in earlier drafts I was trying to change the details of my family. Also, I probably went through 2 or 3 drafts of the book before I put anything in there about Christianity, because that was the story I was really scared to tell. In fact, part of the process of the book was I never knew how it would end while I was drawing it. But then I started living those chapters, the last 2 chapters of the book, in real time. So there's, in the end of Blankets, I go back home for a Christmas, I go back home for my brother's wedding. Those things were happening at the very same time I was drawing the book. So there wasn't a lot of time to process between the experience and the drawing of it.
E dopo che la tua famiglia ha letto il libro, quali sono state le conseguenze?
First, I'll say that my brother and sister loved the book, and they still do. My parents, though, were really not happy with the book because I knew that if they disapproved, which they would, so I kept it secret from my parents until I got the book from the printer. I right away sent them a copy, and I called them on the phone. I was like, I sent you some copies of my book. They should have reached you. And they're like, oh, yeah, we got them. And they had 0 comments. They had nothing to say about it. Until I saw them a couple of months later. I went home for summer, and I was stuck in a car with my parents from Chicago to where I grew up, which is a 6-hour drive, alone in the car with my parents. And at that point, they started sort of attacking me and the book. My father was really upset on a personal level. What right do you have to make our private lives public? Why do you think your childhood was so traumatic? No, I don't think my childhood was special at all. I think everybody's childhood is difficult. That's just the nature of childhood. Also, I didn't set out to make my parents look bad. I said, if you follow the book, maybe in the beginning you seem pretty monstrous, but by the end of the book, these things have resolved. That's sort of the natural trajectory of growing up. My mom, on the other hand, was upset on a spiritual level. It was all about religion. She said I was going to go to hell, and that the book was a work of the devil. And I said, well, I don't really believe in the concept of hell. And my parents started laughing a bit, like, oh, if you don't believe in hell, then you can't believe in heaven. And I was like, yeah, that's true. I don't really believe in the concept of heaven either. I don't believe in an afterlife. And then my parents started almost crying. They were really disturbed by this. And my mom said, well, if you don't believe in heaven, where is there hope? What do you have hope for? And I mean, that's really the core of what Christianity means for her. It's like this anchor, this hope for her. She's already, in a lot of ways, given up on this life. So she lives for this promise of the next life.
E qual è la tua ancora?
It's true, this is a terrible world we live in. It's full of terrible things and trauma. The whole point is to look for beauty here, to look for hope here. I mean, that's the role of an artist, is to take all the chaos and destruction and terrible things and find the beauty and hope in that. And that's, I live for hope here on this world.
Con l'uscita di Blankets non sono tardati ad arrivare complimenti anche da parte di tuoi colleghi. Qual è stata la tua più grande soddisfazione dopo l'uscita e il successo di quest'opera?
So Blankets was like an overnight success, like the very first event I did. But that really hasn't changed. Like as far as on emotional level, in some ways I'm better equipped to deal with it now. When I was 27 and the book came out, it was all very overwhelming. Some of the crazier things that's happened, there was a couple in Washington, D.C. that proposed to each other in front of me to get married. They had carved out a copy of Blankets with the ring inside of the book.
Wow.
And so the woman opened up the book and there was the ring. He got on his knee and proposed to her. Like, when you tell an intimate story of your own, it's not about singling yourself out as special, it's giving everybody permission to feel their stories.
Nel 2004 esce Carnet di viaggio, un'opera molto difficile da recuperare perché mai ristampata di recente in Italia. Potresti convincere il pubblico e la stessa Rizzoli Lizard a ristamparlo nel nostro paese parlandocene un po'?
Yes, in fact, Rizzoli Lizard is going to do a new edition of the book, and I'm going to add new material. So the book is certainly going to have a foreword now in comics form to sort of explain the context of that trip. It's going to have an afterword to explain sort of my processing afterwards. And then it's probably going to have new material from other travels I've made. I think travel's inconvenient and exhausting and chaotic, but in the midst of all those discomforts, you have these really profound moments that like make it all worth it. There was never a convenient moment. Everything was in the real world, you know? I was getting sunburnt or almost run over by cars or donkey carts. It was very, very in the world. And I think as an artist that's the most important.
Dopo Blankets e Carnet di viaggio esce Habibi. Quali sono i parallelismi che possiamo trovare con le tue opere precedenti e come mai hai deciso di esplorare un mondo così diverso da quello di Blankets e Carnet di viaggio?
So after drawing Blankets and Carnet di Voyage, I was very sick of drawing myself. I didn't want to do any more autobio. One was to do a fantasy epic because the Lord of the Rings movies were coming out at that time. But then the other impulse was to do something social, political, like Joe Sacco's comics journalism, like Palestine or Sefer Grajda. And what happened then is sort of those two desires fused together. So that's when I started reading the Quran for the first time and studying Arabic calligraphy and the art and architecture. Basically, Habibi is a fairy tale, a fantasy fairy tale, infused with all of those things. All of these comparison of the Abrahamic faiths of Judaism and Christianity and Islam. It's a book really fueled by American guilt and male guilt. What all started with the calligraphy. Arabic calligraphy has been described as music for the eyes. For me, the calligraphy is basically comics because it's turning words into pictures. And I just love it for its movement, sort of musical qualities, again, sort of rhythm. You know, the Bible is such a, it's very clunky at times. There's elements of the Bible, there's books of the Bible that are poetic, like Ecclesiastes or Psalms. But then there's horrible, tedious books of the Bible. I feel like the Quran in general tends towards more musicality and poetry too, especially if you're listening to it recited in Arabic. There was this need to understand Islam better in the wake of 9/11, where in the United States there was this wave of Islamophobia. There was a very knee-jerk sort of association of terrorism with a religion.
In Habibi uno degli elementi più commoventi è l'amore materno visto da vari punti di vista. Cosa rappresenta per te questo concetto e in che maniera quest'opera lo mette in luce?
I think Habibi in some ways is about long-term relationship, can sort of go through waves of these different phases. So sometimes romantic partners are like siblings. Sometimes they're like parents with each other. One plays the child role and one plays the parent. And then other times they are equal as lovers. I also think like human sexuality goes through waves between both extremes. Sometimes we're very promiscuous and nymphomaniac with our sexuality. At other times we're really cut off and closed off from our sexuality. I think it's normal to sort of go between both polar opposites. The goal is like, well, where do you find the balance between those energies? Where do you find a healthy, healing sexuality?
Arriviamo alla tua ultimissima opera, Polpette spaziali, un'opera più leggera, coloratissima e adatta al pubblico dei più giovani. Perché questo cambio di rotta repentino?
Well, I think the biggest reason was midlife crisis. And I was questioning, why do I do what I do? So when I was 8 years old, comic books imprinted themselves on my psychology. So I felt this need to give back to that 8-year-old child, to sort of replenish the well. So I was making the book that I would have dreamed of when I was 8. That's why there's spaceships, that's why there's humor and comedy. On the surface, it's like a goulash, like a hodgepodge of everything I was obsessed with when I was a kid. But of course, it's also infused with the things that concern me as an adult. Energy crisis, which I think is one of the most pressing. Environmental crisis, climate change. The idea is that it's like what Hergé said about Tintin, it's written for ages 7 to 77. So to a 7-year-old, the book's gonna mean something far different than to a 40-year-old like myself.
Quindi il fatto che siano spariti gli elementi autobiografici e la trama sia più leggera ci fa capire che hai fatto pace col tuo passato.
Yes, that's a good question. And strangely, this book, Polpette Spaziali, has maybe more inside personal jokes than any of the rest of my books. So the family in the book, the father and the mother and the daughter, are based off of real friends. And I said that when I was 8 years old, is the first audience member I had for the book, but the second was a little girl named Violet, who was born almost 5 years ago to two of my best friends. And as soon as she was born, I knew I wanted to dedicate a book to her. And there's a lot of references to the sort of working class culture I grew up in. My father was a plumber. On the surface, it looks like a sci-fi comedy, but all of those elements are just abstracted realities from very personal elements, in fact.
Spesso molti comici sostengono che è molto più difficile far ridere che piangere. È stata dura lasciarsi alle spalle il dramma per potersi affacciare su qualcosa di più leggero e divertente.
When I was drawing blankets, the way I earned my living was I was drawing kids' illustrations and comics. So blankets I didn't get paid for. To earn a living, I worked for Nickelodeon magazine and National Geographic Kids, making 1 or 2 page kids full-color cartoon comics. And they're all humorous. So in fact, that's like a part of my creative personality. When I was making blankets, I was sort of half and half. Half blankets, half kids' cartoons. And this was a chance to get back to that part of my personality.
E quali sono invece i tuoi progetti futuri?
I have 3 projects in mind. One is a collaboration with this 74-year-old French cartoonist named Edmond Baudouin. It's a travelogue, only it's a travelogue with one other person. I'm also started on an erotic book. So a love story, but more sexual. My big project, it's sort of about, it's research driven around China. History of commerce between China and the States, but possibly not a fantasy, possibly a nonfiction book, which I've never done before, to do a comic book that's pure nonfiction.
Cosa consiglia ai giovani fumettisti che come te stanno facendo più lavori per poter campare e allo stesso tempo esordire come creativi?
3 bits of advice. The first is to finish something, because when I was young, I had a bad habit of starting on a project and then abandoning it as soon as I got bored. My second piece of advice is to work in baby steps. Long before I did Goodbye Chunky Rice, I did a comic strip, and that was only 6 panels, and I would do 1 comic strip every week. And I wasn't capable of doing longer stories than that. And I did that for a couple of years before I started doing 1-page stories, 2-page stories, then 10-page stories. By the time I did a 20-page story, I was ready to do a 100-page story. I urge people not to jump instantly into creating a 500-page graphic novel. And then the third is, like, the new generation has the great resource of the internet. It's this great resource for just putting things out there for free for other people to see. I think the biggest cartoonists in North America right now are Kate Beaton and Jillian Tamaki. And both of them serialize their work for free online, and then publishers want to publish them, and people buy the books that have already read all the content for free anyway. So there's no reason not to just start putting stuff out there and let people find you.
Ok, Ok, thank you for your time, thank you very much Mr. Thompson. Niente, abbiamo concluso, vi salutiamo, alla prossima, ringraziamo ancora Craig Thompson per il suo tempo, per questa magnifica intervista e ci vediamo alla prossima.
Thank you. Thanks for the interview.